February 10, 1945. Philippine Sea, approximately 150 nautical miles northeast of Luzon. Lieutenant Commander Tatsunosuke Ariizumi stood in the cramped control room of RO-50, his hands gripping the periscope handles as his submarine crept through water that no longer felt like sanctuary. Through the eyepiece, he watched the American destroyer escort USS Isherwood cutting through the waves above, her searchlights probing the darkness. At 2110 hours, those lights found his boat. RO-50 crash-dived, descending to 395 feet, far beyond her rated depth of 260. The hull groaned under pressure that German or American submarines could withstand, but Japanese boats, built lighter and faster, suffered from weaker construction. Within seconds, the first pattern of depth charges detonated. The explosion ruptured RO-50's diving tank valve. Both periscope lenses shattered. All 6 torpedo tubes began leaking seawater under immense pressure. Then came the second pattern, then the third. Ariizumi counted the splashes overhead, listening to death falling toward his submarine at precise intervals. 6 charges. Pause. 6 more charges. Pause. Another 6. The mathematics were terrifying. Isherwood was dropping depth charges faster than any Japanese submariner had experienced, faster than doctrine suggested was possible, delivering explosive tonnage that exceeded anything in Japanese anti-submarine capabilities. The American destroyer Escort was launching approximately 36 depth charges in minutes, maintaining this rate hour after hour, drawing from magazines that seemed bottomless. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi and thousands of Japanese submarine officers who survived encounters with American anti-submarine forces in 1944 and 1945, these experiences revealed a technological and industrial disparity so profound it shattered every assumption about naval warfare. Japanese submariners had entered the war believing in their tactical superiority, their technological sophistication, their warrior spirit. By early 1945, they understood that spirit meant nothing against an enemy whose destroyers could launch 600 depth charges per hour, whose industrial capacity produced weapons faster than Japan could count them, whose detection systems tracked submarines through technologies Japanese engineers hadn't developed and couldn't counter. The ocean, once Japan's highway to empire, had become an American killing field. The transformation didn't happen through a single dramatic revelation. It occurred through thousands of encounters where Japanese submarines discovered that American anti-submarine warfare had evolved into an integrated system of such overwhelming effectiveness that survival became a matter of luck, rather than skill. The statistics told a story Japanese Naval Command struggled to accept. Between 1941 and 1945, American submarines would sink 1,314 Japanese ships totaling 5.3 million tons, accounting for 56% of all Japanese merchant losses. Japanese submarines, despite their impressive size and sophisticated design, would sink merely 184 Allied ships totaling 1 million tons. But those numbers, devastating as they were, represented only surface reality. The deeper truth lay in how American destroyers and destroyer escorts hunted Japanese submarines. A Fletcher-class destroyer carried approximately 46 depth charges in her magazines. 6 K-gun throwers mounted along her sides could launch 300-pound charges to ranges exceeding 150 yards. 2 stern racks held 16 600-pound charges ready for immediate deployment. The destroyer could fire her K-guns, roll charges from her stern, reload, and repeat the process in continuous cycles that Japanese submariners found incomprehensible. The American industrial machine had created anti-submarine vessels capable of sustained bombardment that transformed depth charge attacks from desperate gambles into systematic destruction. February 10, 1945. As RO-50 endured her third hour underwater, hull plates buckling, air growing foul, men gasping for oxygen, Ariizumi understood what thousands of his comrades had learned before dying. The Americans weren't just better equipped, They operated with technological advantages at every level: detection, tracking, weapons delivery, industrial support that made Japanese submarines obsolete before they ever left port. The depth charge attack that nearly destroyed RO-50 represented the culmination of 4 years of American innovation in anti-submarine warfare. When the war began in December 1941, American destroyers carried primitive sonar systems, unreliable depth charges, and tactical doctrines that gave submarines significant advantages. By 1945, American anti-submarine forces had evolved into hunter-killer groups whose effectiveness terrified every Japanese submariner who encountered them. The journey toward this technological dominance had begun years earlier, in shipyards across the United States, in laboratories where engineers perfected weapons systems, in training facilities where crews learned to coordinate sonar, radar, and depth charge delivery into integrated attacks that left submarines nowhere to hide. When Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi finally surfaced RO-50 after 9 hours submerged, his crew discovered a 40-pound fragment of an American depth charge embedded in the afterdeck, physical evidence of weapons that had nearly killed them all. The fragment came from a Mark 9 depth charge, one of several types American forces deployed with devastating effect. These streamlined charges contained 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than the TNT in earlier weapons. They sank at 22 feet per second, twice the rate of older models, giving submarines half the time to evade. American engineers had solved problems Japanese designers never addressed: fast sinking rates, reliable detonation mechanisms, mass production capacity that kept every destroyer's magazines full. The Fletcher-class destroyer embodied American industrial philosophy applied to naval warfare. 175 Fletchers were completed between 1942 and 1945, more than any other destroyer class in history. They displaced 2,100 tons, measured 376 feet long, and carried crews of 329 officers and enlisted men. Their design prioritized versatility over specialization, allowing them to engage aircraft, surface vessels, and submarines with equal effectiveness. For anti-submarine operations, the Fletchers mounted 6 K-gun depth charge throwers, 3 on each side, plus 2 stern racks holding 16 charges total. Adjacent storage racks held an additional 10 charges. This gave each Fletcher approximately 46 depth charges ready for immediate use, with more stored below decks. The K-gun throwers used black powder charges to launch 300-pound depth charges to ranges of 60, 90, or 150 yards depending on powder load. Flight time ranged from 3.4 to 5.1 seconds. 6 K-guns could be fired simultaneously, creating patterns that bracketed submarines in overlapping blast zones. The stern racks rolled 600-pound charges directly over a submarine's estimated position. Together, K-guns and stern racks created attack patterns of 6 to 10 charges that maximized the probability of inflicting lethal damage. A single Fletcher could drop or fire 30 charges in approximately 5 minutes, reload, and repeat the process. Dedicated anti-submarine escorts carried even larger depth charge magazines. Destroyer escorts of the Buckley class mounted 8 K-gun throwers and 2 stern racks, with magazines holding up to 300 depth charges. These vessels existed solely to kill submarines, and their armament reflected that singular purpose. The mathematics of depth charge effectiveness had been studied exhaustively by American naval researchers. A 600-pound charge needed to detonate within 15 feet of a submarine's pressure hull to rupture it catastrophically. At 30 feet, the charge would disable the submarine, forcing it to surface. At 60 feet, significant damage would occur: equipment failures, hull leaks, electrical system damage that accumulated over multiple attacks. Japanese submarines, built with thinner hulls than German or American boats, were more vulnerable to blast damage. Their maximum safe diving depth of approximately 260 feet, compared to 300 feet for American Gato-class submarines, meant Japanese boats had less depth cushion when evading attacks. Worse, Japanese depth charges were significantly lighter and less powerful than American weapons. typically weighing 230 pounds with only 105 pounds of explosive. Early in the war, Japanese depth charges were fused for shallow detonation, set to explode at 98 feet, 197 feet, or 292 feet. This reflected Japanese ignorance of American submarine capabilities. American boats could dive to 300 feet, often deeper in emergencies. Japanese depth charges exploded harmlessly above them. This advantage ended in May 1943, when Representative Andrew Jackson May of Kentucky, chairman of the House Military Affairs Committee, revealed at a press conference that American submarines could dive deeper than Japanese forces, they realized. May's revelation, broadcast widely by press associations, reached Japanese naval intelligence within days. Japanese anti-submarine forces immediately adjusted their depth charge settings deeper, to approximately 246 feet on average. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, later estimated that May's stupidity cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 sailors killed in action. But even with corrected depth settings, Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained technologically inferior to American capabilities. Japanese destroyers and escorts lacked the sonar sophistication, the depth charge capacity, the coordinated tactics that made American hunter-killer groups so lethal. Japanese vessels typically carried 30 depth charges, compared to 46 on American destroyers and up to 300 on dedicated American submarine hunters. More critically, Japanese vessels couldn't sustain the rate of depth charge delivery that American ships achieved. A typical Japanese depth charge attack involved dropping 7 to 10 charges in a pattern, then waiting while the vessel reacquired sonar contact and repositioned for another attack. This gave submarines time to evade, to dive deeper, to escape the immediate attack zone. American tactics evolved toward continuous pressure. Rather than attacking, waiting, repositioning, American destroyers maintained constant sonar contact and dropped charge after charge in relentless succession. The submarine had no time to think, no opportunity to reposition, no moment to assess damage or plan escapes. The depth charges kept coming, pattern after pattern, hour after hour, until either the submarine was destroyed or the attacking vessel exhausted its magazines. For Japanese submarines encountering this American approach for the first time, the psychological impact was devastating. Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi's experience aboard RO-50 on February 10, 1945, exemplified the terror. 3 full patterns of depth charges fell within minutes. Each pattern consisted of 6 charges from K-guns, plus charges rolled from the stern, creating overlapping blast zones that covered hundreds of yards of ocean. Even when charges missed directly, the cumulative shock waves damaged equipment, loosened fittings, created leaks. After 3 patterns, RO-50 was crippled. Her diving controls malfunctioned. Her periscopes were useless. Her torpedo tubes leaked. Yet the attack continued for 2 more hours as USS Isherwood maintained sonar contact and dropped additional patterns. The American destroyer escort's magazines held sufficient depth charges to conduct this extended attack without concern for conservation. Isherwood's crew had trained extensively in depth charge tactics, knew how to maintain sonar contact while attacking, understood how to predict submarine evasion patterns and adjust fire accordingly. They operated with confidence born from technological superiority and thorough preparation. RO-50 survived only because Isherwood eventually lost sonar contact when the submarine descended to dangerous depths and executed evasive maneuvers that temporarily broke the acoustic lock. Most Japanese submarines weren't as fortunate. The Pacific War became littered with Japanese submarine wrecks, their hulls crushed by depth charges dropped from American vessels whose magazines seemed bottomless. The industrial disparity underlying these encounters was staggering. American shipyards produced destroyers and destroyer escorts at rates Japanese planners considered impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, American yards launched 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, 58 Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers, 98 Gearing-class destroyers, and over 400 destroyer escorts of various classes. This vast fleet of anti-submarine vessels, each carrying dozens, hundreds of depth charges, created a defensive network that Japanese submarines simply couldn't penetrate. More importantly, American logistics ensured these vessels never ran short of ammunition. Depth charges were mass-produced in factories across the United States, shipped to forward bases throughout the Pacific, and distributed to combat vessels with clockwork efficiency. A destroyer that expended her depth charge magazines during combat could replenish within days at advanced bases like Ulithi, Manus, or Saipan. Japanese submarines operating in American-controlled waters faced an enemy whose ammunition supply never faltered. American destroyers could attack aggressively, expending 30 or 40 depth charges without concern, knowing resupply was guaranteed. Japanese vessels, operating with limited logistics and overstretched supply lines, hoarded their depth charges, using them conservatively even when aggressive attacks might have achieved kills. This industrial asymmetry manifested in every aspect of anti-submarine warfare. American depth charges used Torpex explosive, developed specifically for underwater weapons, delivering 50% more explosive force than equivalent weight of TNT. American depth charges featured reliable hydrostatic fuses that detonated at precise depths, adjusted easily before dropping. American depth charges had streamlined shapes that sank quickly and predictably, reaching target depth before submarines could evade. Japanese depth charges used conventional explosives, had less reliable fuses, sank more slowly, and were produced in quantities insufficient to equip all vessels adequately. The technological gap extended beyond weapons to delivery systems. American K-gun throwers were simple, reliable, easily reloaded devices that could be mounted anywhere along a destroyer's deck. 4 to 6 K-guns on a destroyer could be fired in any combination, creating flexible attack patterns tailored to specific tactical situations. Japanese Type 81 depth charge throwers could launch charges to 93 yards, slightly shorter range than American K-guns. Japanese vessels mounted up to 8 throwers on dedicated anti-submarine escorts, comparable to American destroyer escorts. But Japanese throwers were mechanically more complex, harder to reload under combat conditions, and less reliable in rough seas. More critically, Japanese escorts were rare. The Imperial Japanese Navy focused on building large fleet destroyers designed for surface combat, not small escorts optimized for submarine hunting. This doctrinal choice, made before the war began, reflected Japan's offensive naval strategy. Japanese planners expected destroyers to support fleet actions, to screen battleships and carriers, to engage American surface forces in decisive battles. Anti-submarine warfare was considered a defensive mission of secondary importance. American planners recognized that submarines threatened merchant shipping and that protecting convoys required numerous small, cheap escort vessels armed specifically for anti-submarine operations. The destroyer escort program produced over 400 vessels between 1943 and 1945, most carrying 8 K-gun throwers and magazines holding hundreds of depth charges. These vessels formed the backbone of American anti-submarine defenses throughout the Pacific, screening carriers, protecting convoys, hunting Japanese submarines aggressively. Japanese submariners quickly learned to fear the distinctive profiles of American destroyer escorts. These small ships, displacing only 1,300 tons compared to 2,100 tons for Fletchers, were purpose-built submarine killers. They mounted sophisticated sonar, carried vast depth charge magazines, and operated with single-minded determination. An encounter with an American destroyer escort often meant death. The sinking of Japanese submarine RO-501, formerly German U-boat U-1224, demonstrated American anti-submarine capabilities at their peak. On May 13, 1944, approximately 500 nautical miles west of the Cape Verde Islands in the Atlantic, RO-501 was detected by destroyer escort USS Francis M. Robinson, part of a hunter-killer group built around escort carrier USS Bogue. Robinson's sonar operator detected RO 501 at 825 yards. The destroyer escort immediately attacked, firing 24 Hedgehog projectiles, and a head-throwing weapon that hurled contact-fused bombs in an elliptical pattern. This was followed by 5 salvos of Mark 8 magnetic influence depth charges. 4 underwater explosions confirmed hits. RO 501 sank with all 56 hands, her hull crushed by weapons that represented the cutting edge of American anti-submarine technology. The Hedgehog system exemplified American innovation in submarine warfare. Developed by the British and adopted enthusiastically by the United States Navy, Hedgehog fired 24 small projectiles ahead of the attacking ship while maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack. Traditional depth charges required the attacking vessel to pass over the submarine, losing sonar contact in the final moments before dropping charges. This blind spot gave skilled submarine commanders opportunities to evade. Hedgehog eliminated the blind spot. The attacking vessel maintained sonar contact until the moment projectiles struck water, allowing precise targeting based on real-time sonar data. Hedgehog projectiles weighed 35 pounds each, carrying 7 pounds of Torpex explosive. They were armed by contact fuses, meaning they exploded only upon hitting something solid, typically a submarine's hull. If all 24 projectiles missed, they sank harmlessly without exploding, allowing the attacking vessel to immediately fire another salvo without waiting for explosions to dissipate. This rapid-fire capability dramatically increased attack efficiency. By mid-1944, the United States Navy claimed an 8% kill rate with single Hedgehog patterns. By mid-1945, that figure had risen to 10%. These statistics, while seemingly modest, represented revolutionary improvement over conventional depth charge attacks, which achieved approximately 3% kill rates early in the war. More importantly, Hedgehog attacks inflicted damage even when they didn't achieve kills. Near-miss projectiles that detonated close to submarine hulls caused cumulative damage, equipment failures, psychological trauma that made submarines more vulnerable to subsequent attacks. For Japanese submarines encountering Hedgehog-equipped American vessels, the experience was uniquely terrifying. The projectiles fell silently through water, creating no warning splashes like conventional depth charges. They exploded only on contact, meaning every explosion signaled a hit. And American vessels could fire pattern after pattern in rapid succession, maintaining pressure that gave submarines no time to escape. The combination of Hedgehog, conventional depth charges, sophisticated sonar, and inexhaustible magazines created an anti-submarine system that Japanese submariners simply couldn't survive. Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi, commanding RO 50, survived his February 1945 encounter with USS Isherwood because his submarine operated at the edge of American sonar range and executed desperate evasion maneuvers that temporarily broke contact. Most Japanese submarine commanders were less fortunate. The statistics of Japanese submarine losses told a grim story. Japan lost 130 submarines during the war, representing twice the percentage loss rate of American submarines. Approximately 10,000 Japanese submariners died, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. Submarine service, initially considered prestigious and honorable, became recognized as a death sentence by war's end. The majority of these losses occurred in encounters with American anti-submarine forces, whose depth charge capacity and delivery rates exceeded anything Japanese submariners could imagine. A Fletcher-class destroyer conducting a determined attack could drop 30 charges in 5 minutes, reload in 10 minutes, and drop another 30. Over an hour, a single destroyer could deliver 150 depth charges or more, creating blast zones that covered square miles of ocean. Japanese submarines caught in such attacks rarely escaped. Their hulls, lighter than American or German designs, cracked under blast pressures that Allied submarines survived. Their shallow diving depth left them no sanctuary in the depths. Their limited battery capacity meant they couldn't remain submerged long enough to outlast attacks. And American destroyers, with their vast magazines and reliable logistics, could maintain attacks for hours, dropping pattern after pattern until sonar confirmed the submarine's destruction. The title phrase, 600 depth charges per hour, while technically possible for a well-coordinated destroyer group, captures the essence of what Japanese submariners experienced. American anti-submarine forces could sustain rates of depth charge delivery that seemed incomprehensible to crews trained in Japanese doctrines of conservation and limited resources. A task group of 3 destroyers attacking a single submarine could, theoretically, drop 600 charges in an hour if they rotated attacks and maintained continuous pressure. In practice, such attacks were rare because most submarines were destroyed or forced to surface long before 600 charges were expended. But the capability existed, and Japanese submariners who survived prolonged attacks reported experiences that matched the mathematical possibility, hour after hour of continuous explosions, patterns falling in relentless succession. No pause to think or plan or hope. The psychological transformation of Japanese submarine officers paralleled the experience German U-boat commanders endured in the Atlantic, though the Pacific context differed fundamentally. German submariners encountered Allied sonar that stripped away their underwater invisibility through detection technology. Japanese submariners faced something arguably more demoralizing, an enemy whose industrial capacity could sustain rates of weapons delivery that rendered evasion meaningless. It wasn't that American sonar was dramatically superior to Japanese hydrophones, though it was. It wasn't that American depth charges were vastly more powerful than Japanese weapons, though they were. The crushing reality was that American anti-submarine forces could throw so many depth charges, so quickly, for so long, that Japanese submarines simply drowned under explosive tonnage. Commander Tatsunosuke Ariizumi, who developed much of Japan's submarine doctrine before the war, would commit suicide aboard I-401 rather than face surrender in August 1945. He understood what many Japanese naval officers were beginning to accept. Japan had challenged an industrial power whose weapons production exceeded anything Japanese planners had anticipated. The evidence accumulated through thousands of individual encounters. Japanese submarine I-26, one of the most successful boats in the Imperial Japanese Navy, sank more than 51,000 tons of Allied shipping, including the aircraft carrier USS Wasp and the light cruiser USS Juno. Yet, even I-26 experienced the terror of American depth charge attacks that demonstrated technological and industrial superiority Japan couldn't match. On August 31, 1942, I-26 torpedoed the carrier USS Saratoga, south of Guadalcanal. American destroyers USS Phelps and USS McDonough immediately established sonar contact and began dropping depth charges. The attack continued for hours as the destroyers maintained contact and systematically worked over the area where I-26 was submerged. The submarine survived only through desperate maneuvering and the fortuitous presence of thermal layers that disrupted American sonar. USS Monson remained behind after Phelps and McDonough departed, conducting additional depth charge attacks that continued into the night. I-26's commanding officer, Commander Minoru Yokota, later reported that the sustained nature of the attack, the seemingly endless supply of depth charges the Americans possessed, was more frightening than the explosions themselves. Japanese doctrine assumed escorts would drop perhaps 10 to 15 charges, then break off to conserve ammunition. The Americans dropped 30, 40, 50 charges without pause. The message was clear. American vessels didn't need to conserve ammunition. Their magazines were full, and resupply was guaranteed. For Japanese submariners, this realization fundamentally altered how they approached every patrol. Conservation became survival. Japanese submarines hoarded their torpedoes, fired fewer rounds, avoided attacks that might draw American anti-submarine forces. The aggressive tactics that characterized early war operations gave way to cautious survival-focused behavior. Submarines that once hunted American carriers began focusing on reconnaissance, supply runs, evacuation missions, anything that avoided encounters with American destroyers whose depth charge magazines seemed bottomless. The industrial foundation underlying American anti-submarine superiority was staggering in scope. Depth charge production in the United States involved dozens of factories coordinating component manufacture and assembly. The Mark 7 depth charge, standard issue from 1942 onward, weighed 600 pounds and contained 300 pounds of TNT. Later versions used torpex, requiring specialized facilities capable of handling the unstable, explosive. Production rates reached thousands of units per month by 1943. American factories produced Mark 6 depth charges for K-gun use, Mark 7 charges for stern racks, Mark 9 streamlined charges with improved sinking rates, Mark 8 magnetic influence charges, hedgehog projectiles, and numerous other variants. Each type required different manufacturing processes, different explosive compounds, different fusing mechanisms. The industrial coordination necessary to produce these weapons in sufficient quantities, distribute them across the Pacific, and ensure every destroyer's magazines remained full, represented logistical achievement Japanese forces couldn't replicate. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by demands for aircraft, warships, ammunition, and basic war materials, couldn't match American depth charge production. Japanese factories produced Type 2 depth charges in limited quantities, with explosive fills of 230 pounds compared to 300 pounds in American Mark 7 charges. Quality control suffered as the war progressed. Fuses became less reliable. Explosive compounds varied in stability. Depth charges that should have detonated at specific depths sometimes failed completely or exploded prematurely. More critically, Japanese logistics couldn't guarantee resupply. A destroyer that expended her depth charges attacking an American submarine might wait weeks or months for replacements. Forward bases lacked adequate magazines. Supply ships carrying depth charges were themselves targets for American submarines. The entire logistics chain was vulnerable, inefficient, inadequate. American logistics, by contrast, functioned with industrial precision. Advanced bases throughout the Pacific maintained massive ammunition dumps. Destroyer tenders could resupply depth charges within hours. Fleet auxiliaries carried reserve stocks. The entire system was designed to ensure combat vessels never lacked ammunition. A Fletcher-class destroyer operating from Ulithi in late 1944 could expend her entire depth charge magazine, attacking a Japanese submarine, return to the anchorage, replenish within a day, and return to combat operations. Japanese destroyers operating from Truk or Rabaul faced chronic ammunition shortages that limited their effectiveness, even when opportunities for attacks arose. The Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, demonstrated American destroyer capabilities in surface combat, but the battle's aftermath revealed how American anti-submarine forces operated against Japanese submarines attempting to exploit the chaos. Japanese submarine I-26, commanded by Commander Shunichi Shimizu, attempted to attack American escort carriers during the battle's conclusion. American destroyer escorts USS Coolbar and USS Richard M. Rowell detected I-26 on sonar and immediately attacked. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, as both destroyer escorts claimed the kill, but I-26 was sunk by depth charge attacks that lasted several hours and involved dozens of charges dropped in coordinated patterns. The last contact with I-26 occurred on October 25. She was officially presumed lost on November 21, 1944, and struck from the Navy list on March 10, 1945. For Japanese Naval Command, the loss of I-26, the third highest scoring submarine in terms of tonnage sunk, represented more than the destruction of one boat. It symbolized the systematic elimination of Japan's submarine force by American anti-submarine capabilities that had evolved beyond anything Japanese planners anticipated. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare had shifted decisively by late 1944. American combat records showed that single-depth charge patterns achieved approximately 3% kill rates in early 1942. By late 1943, improved weapons and tactics had increased these figures substantially. Approximately 30% of detected submarines suffered damage, and 20% were killed. By the last year of the war, at least 35% of submarines attacked were damaged, while 30% were killed. These statistics reflected the cumulative impact of better sonar, more powerful depth charges, faster delivery systems, improved tactics, and most importantly, the capacity to sustain attacks until submarines were destroyed. Japanese submarines, operating with technological disadvantages and facing opponents with unlimited ammunition, had minimal chances of survival once detected. The crew's skill, the commander's experience, the submarine's capabilities, all meant less than the simple fact that American destroyers could drop more depth charges faster than Japanese submarines could evade them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Commander Sadatoshi Norita, commanding RO 501, never had opportunity to report what he experienced during his final hours. On May 13, 1944, after broadcasting a coded signal indicating his submarine had been chased for 2 days, RO 501 encountered USS Francis M. Robinson's hunter-killer group. The destroyer escort's sonar operator detected RO 501 at 825 yards. Robinson's commanding officer, Lieutenant John E. Johansson, immediately initiated attack procedures. Robinson fired her Hedgehog, 24 projectiles arcing ahead of the ship, while sonar tracked the target. Then came 5 salvos of Mark 8 depth charges, each salvo containing multiple charges set to different depths. The water around RO 501 erupted in overlapping explosions. 4 distinct underwater explosions were heard, indicating direct hits. The submarine sank in 2,900 feet of water, carrying Commander Norita, 52 Japanese crew, 2 German technicians, and 4 Japanese naval engineering passengers to their deaths. The attack from detection to destruction lasted approximately 20 minutes. Robinson's crew expended 24 Hedgehog projectiles and approximately 30 to 40 depth charges, a fraction of the destroyer escort's total magazine capacity. The vessel could have sustained similar attacks for hours if necessary. For Commander Norita and his crew, death came swiftly through technologies they couldn't counter. The magnetic influence depth charges that contributed to RO 501's destruction represented cutting-edge anti-submarine weaponry. These charges used magnetic sensors to detect submarine hulls passing nearby, detonating automatically when they sensed the magnetic anomaly created by steel pressure hulls. The technology was imperfect. Magnetic influence fuses proved unreliable in practice, sometimes detonating prematurely or failing entirely. The United States Navy eventually discontinued their widespread operational use, reverting to more reliable hydrostatic fuses. But during the period when magnetic charges were deployed, they added another layer of threat Japanese submariners couldn't predict or counter. A depth charge set to detonate at 200 feet might instead explode at 150 feet if its magnetic sensor detected a submarine hull. This unpredictability made evasion even more difficult. Japanese submariners couldn't develop tactics against weapons whose behavior they couldn't anticipate. The variety of American depth charge types compounded Japanese problems. Mark 6 charges weighing 300 pounds for K-gun use. Mark 7 charges weighing 600 pounds for stern racks. Mark 9 streamlined charges with faster sinking rates. Mark 8 magnetic influence charges, Hedgehog projectiles that exploded on contact. Each weapon type had different characteristics, different optimal employment methods, different tactical implications. American anti-submarine forces could select appropriate weapons for specific situations. Shallow water attacks used lighter charges with shallow settings. Deep diving submarines required heavy charges with deep settings and fast sinking rates. Ahead-throwing Hedgehogs were ideal when maintaining sonar contact was critical. Conventional depth charges excelled at saturation attacks that covered large areas. This tactical flexibility reflected industrial depth Japanese forces couldn't match. Japan produced essentially one type of depth charge, the Type 2, with limited variations. Japanese anti-submarine forces had fewer options, less flexibility, more predictable attack patterns that skilled submarine commanders could evade. American submarine captains quickly learned Japanese depth charge tactics and developed effective countermeasures. Diving deep, below 300 feet, usually meant safety because Japanese charges were fused for shallower detonation. Changing course erratically during attacks confused Japanese sonar operators who lacked sophisticated fire control systems. Releasing oil or debris often convinced Japanese escorts they had achieved kills, causing them to break off attacks prematurely. Japanese submariners had no equivalent tactical advantages against American forces. American depth charges could be fused from 50 feet to 600 feet depth. American sonar could track submarines through most evasive maneuvers. American escorts rarely mistook oil slicks for kills, instead maintaining attacks until sonar confirmed hull breakup or debris confirmed destruction. The systematic nature of American anti-submarine doctrine left Japanese submarines with one viable tactic: avoid detection entirely. Once detected, survival became unlikely. This defensive mindset pervaded Japanese submarine operations by late 1944. Submarines that once aggressively hunted American carriers now crept cautiously through waters where American destroyers prowled with seemingly unlimited depth charges. The human cost of American anti-submarine superiority was written in Japanese submarine losses that accelerated dramatically through 1944 and 1945. RO-45, commissioned in January 1944, was sunk during her first combat sortie in April 1944. Destroyers USS McDonough and USS Stephen Potter detected the submarine 40 nautical miles south of Truk, established sonar contact, and conducted depth charge attacks that destroyed the boat within hours. Oil and debris confirmed the kill. RO-45's crew, trained for months, experienced in tactics, confident in their equipment, died on their first patrol because American destroyers found them, tracked them, and killed them with weapons Japanese submarines couldn't survive. RO-56, commissioned in November 1944, lasted slightly longer. On April 9, 1945, American destroyers USS Monson and USS Mertz detected RO-56 on sonar while escorting carriers of Task Force 58. Monson dropped 3 depth charge patterns. Mertz joined the attack, dropping 3 more patterns. Monson then made 2 additional attacks. RO-56 sank with all 79 crew members. From commissioning to destruction, 5 months. 1 war patrol. Death by depth charges dropped in systematic patterns by destroyers whose magazines contained sufficient ammunition to sink a dozen submarines. RO-49 survived longer through luck and cautious tactics. Commissioned in May 1944, she conducted 3 war patrols before her final sortie in March 1945. On April 5, 1945, destroyer USS Hudson detected RO-49 on surface radar near Okinawa. The submarine dived when Hudson fired a star shell. Hudson established sonar contact and conducted 6 depth charge attacks over 6 hours, systematically working over the area where the submarine attempted to hide. RO-49 sank at 26 degrees 22 minutes north, 126 degrees 30 minutes east. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. Japanese submarines ventured out on patrol, American destroyers detected them, depth charges fell in overwhelming quantities, submarines died. By late 1944, Japanese submarine operations had become suicide missions. Officers and crews understood the statistics. Most boats never returned. The ocean had become an American killing ground where Japanese submarines were prey. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commanding the 6th Fleet, which controlled submarine operations, watched his force systematically destroyed. In November 1944, he attended RO-50's departure from Kure, personally seeing Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi off on patrol. The gesture reflected desperation. Senior commanders didn't normally attend individual submarine departures. Miwa's presence acknowledged what everyone knew. RO-50 probably wouldn't return. She did return, damaged severely by USS Isherwood's depth charge attack, but most submarines weren't as fortunate. Of the submarines that departed on patrol in late 1944 and early 1945, more than half never came back. American depth charges, dropped from destroyers whose magazines seemed inexhaustible, crushed their hulls and killed their crews with industrial efficiency. The destroyer escort USS England achieved legendary status by sinking 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, practiced an unusual hands-off command style that gave his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, freedom to train the crew intensively in anti-submarine tactics. The combination proved devastatingly effective. On May 18, 1944, England and 2 other destroyer escorts set out to find and destroy Japanese submarines of Squadron 7, deployed along a patrol line to provide early warning of American forces approaching the Marianas. England's sonar operators detected I-16 at 2300 hours. Williamson maneuvered the destroyer escort into attack position and fired a hedgehog salvo. The projectiles struck I-16, and she sank with all hands. Over the next 11 days, England detected and destroyed RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, RO-108, and RO-105 inches succession. Each attack followed similar patterns: sonar detection, careful approach, hedgehog salvo, underwater explosions, debris, and oil confirming kills. England's crew had mastered anti-submarine warfare through relentless training. They could maintain sonar contact through submarine evasive maneuvers. They could predict where submarines would be when projectiles reached target depth. They could fire hedgehog salvos with precision that turned complex attacks into routine procedures. More importantly, England operated with confidence born from knowing she carried sufficient ammunition for dozens of attacks. Her magazines held depth charges and hedgehog projectiles enough to sink every submarine in Squadron 7 if necessary. Japanese submariners facing England had no technological counter, no tactical response, no hope beyond luck. The 6 submarines England destroyed represented carefully trained crews, sophisticated vessels, months of preparation. They died within days because American anti-submarine warfare had evolved into a system that Japanese submarines simply couldn't survive. The industrial capacity that supported England's success extended across the entire American anti-submarine force. Every destroyer escort, every hunter-killer group operated with the same confidence. Ammunition was plentiful, resupply was guaranteed, detection equipment was sophisticated, training was thorough. The entire system was designed to find Japanese submarines and kill them with overwhelming firepower. Japanese submariners who survived encounters with American anti-submarine forces carried memories that haunted them for life. The sound of depth charges detonating close to the hull, a sharp metallic bang followed by thunderous booms. The sensation of the submarine being lifted bodily by underwater explosions. The groaning of hull plates under stress. The shattering of gauges and equipment. The smell of fear as men realized they were being hunted by forces they couldn't fight. Most terrifying was the relentlessness. American attacks didn't stop after 10 charges or 15 charges. They continued, pattern after pattern, hour after hour, until the submarine was destroyed or miraculously escaped. Japanese submariners learned that once detected, survival depended on luck, not skill. The best commanders with the best crews died as easily as novices when American destroyers began dropping depth charges. Lieutenant Commander Ariizumi, commanding RO-50, survived his February 1945 encounter with USS Isherwood through combination of desperate tactics and fortunate circumstances. He drove his submarine to 395 feet, nearly 150 feet beyond safe diving depth. He executed violent, evasive maneuvers that temporarily broke sonar contact. He maintained absolute silence inside the boat, every unnecessary system shut down, every man frozen at his station. Even then, survival was uncertain. 3 full patterns of depth charges damaged RO-50 severely. The diving tank valve ruptured, both periscopes were destroyed, all torpedo tubes leaked. The submarine remained submerged for 9 hours, air growing foul, carbon dioxide levels rising dangerously, men gasping for oxygen. When RO-50 finally surfaced, Ariizumi discovered the 40-pound depth charge fragment on his afterdeck. Physical evidence of how close his submarine had come to destruction. Physical proof that American depth charges, dropped from a destroyer escort whose magazine held hundreds more charges, had nearly killed his entire crew. RO-50 limped back to Kure for repairs. She survived to conduct additional patrols, but Ariizumi understood what the February attack revealed. American anti-submarine forces possessed capabilities Japanese submarines couldn't counter. The depth charges would keep falling, faster than Japanese submarines could evade, more powerful than Japanese hulls could withstand, in quantities that Japanese industrial capacity couldn't match. The ocean no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to the nation that could produce 600 depth charges for every hour of combat, that could equip every destroyer with magazines full of explosive power, that could sustain anti-submarine operations at industrial scale. By early 1945, the systematic destruction of Japan's submarine force was nearly complete. Of approximately 70 submarines Japan possessed in December 1941, plus those built during the war, most had been destroyed by American anti-submarine forces. The survivors operated with extreme caution, avoiding areas where American destroyers prowled, conducting reconnaissance rather than attacks, serving primarily as transports for desperate supply missions to isolated garrisons. The transformation from confident warriors to terrified survivors was total. Japanese submariners who had entered the war believing in their tactical and technological superiority now understood they had challenged an industrial power whose weapons production, logistics capabilities, and technological innovation exceeded anything Japan could match. The final months of the war saw Japanese submarines reduced to kamikaze missions. Kaiten, human-guided torpedoes essentially manned suicide weapons, were launched from submarines against American shipping. The tactic reflected desperation. Japan's submarine force, once considered a premier weapon, had been reduced to delivering suicide attackers because conventional submarine tactics no longer worked against American defenses. Even these desperate missions failed. American sonar detected submarines approaching, American destroyers attacked with depth charges, and submarines carrying Kaiten were destroyed before launching their weapons. The industrial and technological superiority that manifested in depth charge capacity extended to every aspect of anti-submarine warfare. American destroyers had better sonar, better radar, better communications, better damage control, better training, and most critically, unlimited ammunition. Japanese submarines faced opponents who could afford to expend 30 depth charges to kill one submarine because their factories produced thousands of depth charges per month, and their logistics delivered those charges to combat vessels, without interruption. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, only a handful of submarines remained operational. Most had been sunk by American anti-submarine forces, whose depth charge attacks represented the cutting edge of industrial warfare. The survivors, including RO-50, surrendered to American forces and were subsequently scuttled in Operation Road's End. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, made a point of having his flag hoisted aboard captured Japanese submarines during surrender ceremonies. The symbolism was clear. American submarines and American anti-submarine forces had dominated the Pacific through technological and industrial superiority that Japan couldn't match. Japanese submarine officers brought aboard American destroyers after surrender were given tours of the vessels that had hunted them so effectively. They examined the sonar equipment, the depth charge magazines, the K-gun throwers, the Hedgehog launchers. Everything was more sophisticated than equivalent Japanese systems. More importantly, everything was abundant. The magazines were full, spare parts were available. The logistics train supporting these vessels never failed. American naval officers explained the tactics used to hunt submarines, the coordinated attacks, the sustained pressure, the willingness to expend 30 or 40 depth charges because magazines held hundreds more and resupply was guaranteed within days. Japanese officers listened with understanding born from painful experience. They had lived through these attacks. They had felt the depth charges falling in patterns that seemed endless. They had survived by luck when skill proved insufficient. For these Japanese submarine veterans, touring American destroyers confirmed what they already knew. Japan had challenged an industrial power whose production capacity, technological innovation, and logistical sophistication exceeded anything Japanese planners anticipated. The depth charges that fell on Japanese submarines, pattern after pattern, hour after hour, represented just one manifestation of industrial disparity that pervaded every aspect of the war. American factories produced depth charges by the thousands. Japanese factories struggled to produce hundreds. American shipyards launched destroyers by the dozens. Japanese shipyards managed singles. American logistics kept every vessel supplied with ammunition. Japanese logistics failed to maintain basic operations. The outcome was inevitable once the industrial machinery reached full production. The human cost was written in 10,000 Japanese submariners who died during the war, most killed by American depth charges that crushed their submarines in depths they couldn't escape. These men, trained carefully, equipped as well as Japanese industry could manage, confident in their warrior spirit, discovered that spirit meant nothing against opponents whose destroyers could launch 600 depth charges per hour if necessary. The ocean floor of the Pacific holds their remains, submarines crushed by explosive power, crews entombed in steel coffins, victims of industrial warfare conducted at scale Japanese forces never imagined possible. The lessons learned by Japanese submarine officers influenced post-war naval development for decades. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in the 1950s, incorporated American anti-submarine technologies and tactics. Japanese submariners trained with American instructors, learned American doctrines, operated boats designed with American assistance. The former enemies became allies united by recognition that technological excellence and industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern warfare. By the 1980s, Japan's submarines were among the world's finest, incorporating lessons learned through painful defeat. The submariners who had been hunted by American depth charges now built submarines that could evade equivalent weapons, having learned what victory taught their former enemies. The recordings of I-52's destruction, preserved on wire spools in American archives, remain as testimony to the technological revolution in anti-submarine warfare. Modern analysis confirmed that acoustic homing torpedoes guided by sonar buoy transmissions destroyed I-52 conclusively. But the technology that killed Commander Uno Kameo and his crew represented just one system in an integrated approach that included depth charges, hedgehog projectiles, sophisticated sonar, coordinated tactics, and unlimited industrial support. Japanese submarines faced all these systems simultaneously, creating defensive networks they couldn't penetrate. The story of Japanese submarine crews realizing American destroyers could launch 600 depth charges per hour is ultimately a story about industrial warfare conducted at scale that exceeded human experience. The Fletcher-class destroyers and destroyer escorts that hunted Japanese submarines weren't just better armed. They were manifestations of industrial capacity that could afford to expend vast quantities of ammunition because factories produced unlimited replacements and logistics delivered those replacements without failure. Japanese submariners weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were operating with inadequate technology against forces possessing decisive advantages. The psychological journey from confidence to recognition of defeat paralleled other Axis experiences with American industrial might. The ocean that Japanese submariners once prowled with confidence became an American domain through technology and industry. Depth charges falling from destroyers whose magazines never emptied, sonar tracking submarines that couldn't hide, hedgehog projectiles striking hulls with precision Japanese forces couldn't achieve, hunter-killer groups coordinating attacks that eliminated submarines systematically. The transformation was complete by mid-1945, leaving Japanese submarines with nowhere to operate, no safe waters, no hope of survival. When American submarines of Operation Barney penetrated the Sea of Japan in June 1945 using FM sonar to navigate through minefields, Japanese planners believed impregnable, the psychological defeat of Japanese naval forces was total. If American submarines could enter waters Japan considered absolutely secure, then nowhere was safe. The ocean belonged to those who controlled the technology. Japanese submariners understood this lesson viscerally. They had been hunted, tracked, and killed by technologies they couldn't see and couldn't counter. Those who survived carried knowledge that Japan's defeat was inevitable once American industrial and technological superiority manifested fully. The ocean was never truly Japan's. It had only taken time for reality to assert itself. American depth charges, dropping from destroyers whose magazines seemed bottomless, had transformed submarine warfare. Japanese submariners, regardless of their skill or courage, were operating in an environment where the enemy possessed decisive technological and industrial advantages. The realization came gradually through accumulated encounters, close escapes, reports from other submarines. By 1945, it was universal among survivors. The ocean no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the nation that built the technology to control it. America had won the undersea war, not through superior seamanship, but through superior industrial capacity. The legacy endures in modern naval warfare, where depth charges remain fundamental anti-submarine weapons. The technological revolution that stunned Japanese submariners in 1944 and 1945 continues evolving. But the fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Technological superiority, backed by industrial capacity, determines outcomes in modern warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.